We have family in Florida, so most summers we enjoy taking a long, leisurely drive down there to stay with them for quite some time. We have seen all sorts of weird and wonderful sights on those drives. We'll see something and all call it out. After all, it only happens in Florida. But they have all been fun, weird, silly, odd, and downright hilarious. We have only ever seen two things that have scared us on those long drives. One time, we drove past what looked like a carjacking. Rightly or wrong, Dad put his foot on the gas, and we sped past as fast as we could. No way we were going to try and stop and help when we saw guns. Mom did call 911 though. We're not heartless. That scared us all, and for days after, I kept thinking they'd seen the plates. So much so, I made Dad buy an overpriced Disney vanity plate, just so they couldn't track us down. As scary as that was, you just need to turn on the news to hear it. The other time we were all freaked out. That's the kind of thing they don't tend to show you on the news. Our family ain't in Orlando or even Jacksonville. They live in the part of Florida that most tourists don't likely even know exist. There's lots of swampland, and you gotta be really careful about gators. But I feel like most Floridans know that. Everybody where they live knows that. We all know that from our hours we spent driving. So when we first saw the gator on the side of the road, we were glad we were all in the car. But of course, seeing a gator that up close and knowing you are safe being inside a hunk of metal, my brother was all like, drive past real slow so I can see his teeth. You know, the kind of thing only a 10-year-old boy would say. It was kind of funny. Like maybe had it broken a limb or something, and he wanted to see if it was all gnarly. Of course, my dad, who oftentimes still thought he was a 10-year-old boy too, did just that. We slowed right down to drive past and get a good look at this thing, when all of a sudden, it stands up completely on two legs. The reason it had been walking funny was because it had long legs, not like what belongs on gators at all. So it stands up on those not right legs and looks right at us. And I swear, my entire family gasped in unison as we noticed its eyes were like that of a person. Its head and neck should by rights be stuck up in the air, but no. It bends like a person, so its eyes and mouth are looking right at us. Then it opens its huge jaws and takes a run towards the car. At this point, my little brother and I are crying, screaming. Mom in the front is telling our father to get out of there, and thankfully, that's just what he does, flooring the car, leaving us nearly wrecked. My mother said it gave chase for a while, but gladly it gave up. That's one of the worst memories I've ever had in my life. In fact, my family and I don't even really talk about it. It's not exactly traumatic, but something we don't like to acknowledge, I guess, if you want to say that. A little later on in life, when I would learn more about the people and the natives that live in this area of the world, Florida and the South, I would learn that I guess there's supposed rituals that would turn some of the tribesmen into humanoid reptilian beings, or reptilian shapeshifters, I guess if you want to call it that. My thoughts and memory immediately put me back to that memory I just recalled for you, and I wonder, did we run into one of those things that was scouring the swamp? We'll never know. I was driving home from work one night when I saw somebody standing at the side of the road. To start with, I thought it might have been a hitchhiker, and my first thought was, who the hell these days wants to be picked up by a stranger? They were facing away from me, and I found it a little odd that they didn't seem to notice my car was coming towards them. Not that I was going to directly hit them. There was plenty of space, but I found it strange that they did not even turn towards me when they saw my lights. It was pretty dark at this point. Then, as I got closer, I began to notice something very weird about this person. At first, because it was dark, I thought they were dressed in dark military clothing. There was a lot of green and brown, but as I get closer, it looked nothing like clothing. Then, and I say it because I realized it was not a person. It looked and turned at me. Its body didn't move, just its head. And honest to God Almighty, the best way I'm able to describe it would be to say it was a lizard person. Simple. It was tall like a man, which was why I had first assumed it to be a human. It was entirely naked. It seemed to be covered in a weird slime, I guess. It had long, slender legs, and the head of a very elongated lizard, like a damn huge lizard. It didn't move its body at all, just the head, with unblinking eyes as my car drove past. And yes, you can bet I put my foot down on the gas and I drove. I looked in my mirror, just so I could see from my taillights that it never moved. It just remained there, staring at my car as I disappeared. I'll never forget that night, knowing there are other animals out there that exist, beyond my comprehension. I'm a sanitation technician in the Florida waterways. I'll leave the town I work for out of it, since I don't want anything to trace back to me, and potentially risk losing my job and career, especially in times of COVID-19. Everybody knows the economy is strained enough with all the joblessness. I really wish not to be counted among them. Anyway, sanitation technician. It's just a fancy way of saying that if you have a problem in your sewer in Florida, I'm most likely the guy that has to take care of it. Yay. I mean, we've all heard the stories about crocodiles in sewers. It's not exactly impossible. And chances are the story that you've heard isn't true. But that doesn't mean that those scaly things have never set foot inside. But I have a story for you that's more true than any of the stories that you've ever heard. Well, my story is also going to be less believable than anything you've ever heard. So bear with me. Some parts of town were experiencing flooding some time ago, specifically their basements, and other signs that the sewers were backing up. This was puzzling, because it was during a very dry spell. Well, dry for the Florida area. So naturally, they sent me and a few others to do underground work to investigate. You would think that in this line of work, which is oh so critical, there would be more state-of-the-art equipment that would help us. There was tons of trial and error, searching down in the dark with all the million things that are above ground. It didn't take us long to find out what was obstructing the flow of water. We just weren't sure what to make of it. And at first, we thought that they were rocks, but they appeared too round and too consistent in size. The first thing I thought when I saw them is they kind of looked like very, very large crocodile eggs, or alligator eggs. I always intermix the two, but it's important to note, as a Florida native, to those who read this, that no, crocodiles do not live in Florida. It's only alligators, at least to my knowledge. But anyway, what kind of animal gets into the sewers and lays eggs, especially of this size? I'm kidding you not. They were shy of being the size of literal basketballs, which would mean that there is an enormous mama alligator somewhere. I mean, I guess it's not too unheard of to have a 50-foot alligator, maybe in a movie, but not here in reality. So that's where my mind immediately went to. A few of these were as small as cantaloupes, but not many. My thoughts were then interrupted by a loud splash beside me. I turned my light onto something huge, scaly, and appearing to scramble to its feet to reach a size of at least 3 or 4 heads taller than I. The eyes were large and copper-colored, and they were full and teeming of hate that I had never seen in an animal's eyes before. It looked like somebody had crossbred a professional wrestler with a dinosaur, and the sight, smell, and sound of the thing terrified me and electrified my nerves. This thing then turned and jumped into the water next to us. I had no idea what this was or what it was planning. I had never seen an animal or creature like this in my life, but me and my crew used this moment of advantage and bolted during the critical moment. We all told the same story, having witnessed the same thing, but all of us were suspended without payment. So, I feel like this is a perfect opportunity to really get this story out there, and I'm trying to remain anonymous, as to hopes it doesn't come back on me. But if more people can be mindful of the things that actually exist, and stop being so quick to write off things we don't really know about in our reality, I think we'd be a lot more prepared for the unknown. I was hunting alligators in an area that is probably illegal, so I'm just going to tell you that I was in a swamp where many crocs are, and that many people aren't. I guess I'm considered very skittish, so I choose to be up in hunting blinds as to guarantee that I have the element of surprise nearly every time. After all, I've never seen a croc once being able to properly climb a tree. Eventually, it did happen, and I saw movement down below, where it almost looked like a dead log was drifting along. It was a drifting log that had scales, so I knew I had found my catch. If you don't know what to look for, well, anything can be very convincing. I aimed for where the head was and fired. I smiled to myself and began to make my way down. If I had acted a second sooner, I would consider myself in serious trouble. The water sprayed as if a bomb had gone off. Some sort of lizard monster leapt out onto the grass, and it was giving every indication of being full of rage. The reason why, well, I just took a shot at it. There was a large wound in its right shoulder. The thing standing upright on 2 feet that had a large barrel-shaped body hinted at the fact clearly that it wasn't an average alligator. This thing was an abomination. Its back being slightly haunched. It's blasting me with ear-splitting shrieks, and it whipped around, looking at me. The snout had been longer, and it could have easily passed for a dinosaur. Except the dinosaurs don't act like this. It set its gaze on me, and then took a step toward, getting ready to attack. I didn't come down from my blind until I couldn't hold my nose any more than I needed to. I wasn't going to waste any more time, so I took several more shots at this thing. And in order to avoid my bullets, this thing dove back into the water and disappeared underneath. Where it went, I'm not exactly sure. But that never happened though. It never resurfaced. Has anybody else spotted lizards out here that can walk like this? Or are they just built like a wrestler? I've reached out to this sub because, well, I'm looking for answers. Part of me really wants to think that it was just a dream that I had all the while nodding off in a blind. But maybe I'm missing the rounds for my ammo, so I know that the encounter did happen. I have to be more afraid now than ever for the law looking out for illegal hunting, and it feels like I may never actually sleep peacefully again. So, I'm wanting to ask you guys, what the hell did I see? What did I encounter? I love to swim. It's one of my favorite things to do. On top of that, I love finding places that are a little more unusual to take a bath in. So, not pools or lakes or the ocean. I prefer rivers and swamps and springs, places that can be found off the beaten track. Now, of course, I know these places can tend to be dangerous. I'm a very competent and strong swimmer, but I don't fancy my chances against a gator, so I'm not dumb. I have seen all sorts of weird stuff in those rivers and swamps. Even once found a body. Didn't stick around too long after I noticed it was a human swaying against the current. I dialed 911, and I was out of there. Turned out to be some poor runaway. At least the parents got closure, and the body buried. You think that would be the worst thing I've ever seen, right? Well, it isn't. One day, I was out deep in Louisiana swamps, and I saw something that utterly blew my mind. As I said, I like to find hidden, unique away places to take a dip, but I'm also careful not to end up as some croc's dinner. Well, in and around, you gotta be careful. Snakes are dangerous too. I've seen some of them crawling around near the water, and a damn side bigger than I am. So, what I found this stretch of water, it was like some offshoot from the bayou. I did all my usual checks and balances before I even put a foot. I couldn't see any obvious signs. I stuck a long stick in the water, swirled it up real good, and no long slithering body surfaced. So, I thought I was safe. I got in, feeling that immense pleasure that I get from knowing I'm maybe the only person around here. As I'm slowly swimming around, feeling pleased with myself and very smug, I instantly get the sensation when you know somebody or something is looking at you. I could feel these eyes boring into my back. Also, I'm used to some funky smells hitting me when I'm out there in these waters, especially the swamps, where stagnant mud gets all swirled about. But this was awful. Like a damn stank, like I was on a pig farm, and they'd been rolling around in their own feces all day. I turned around, real slow-like, as I don't want to spook whatever's behind me, just praying real hard that it wasn't no gator. If I told you that finding a human foot was like finding Santa had been on Christmas morning compared to what I now saw in the water, that might suggest to you just how much fear I was experiencing. It weren't no gator. Well, not any kind of gator like I've ever seen. It was bigger than me and was standing in the water. The river wasn't that deep. If I was to stand, my feet on the ground, it would likely come up to my waist. The thing in front of me must have been real tall, as the water barely covered where his groin is. It was real strong looking. Its torso was like that of an alligator or reptile, but if you flipped it onto its back, all scaly but real ripped and muscly. It did have human-like arms, dangling from the side, rather than little gator limbs, although its hands looked like they were webbed and clawed. It had a long, thick neck. Again, I could literally see the muscles throbbing, like some bodybuilder on steroids. And then finally, the head. Now, it didn't have a regular alligator-looking head. Like anything, nothing about what I was looking at was normal in any way. The head resembled more of a lizard, or a snake. Large bulbous shapes, with no visible nose or ears. Just two large yellow eyes, and a large forked mouth. Tons of tiny sharp teeth. It just stood there, standing its ground, not moving closer to me, but not backing away further. I really thought I was a goner. I kind of got the hint that it was contesting its ground. Maybe somebody would be finding my dismembered body floating around in the water. That's if this thing didn't just decide to devour me whole. So, you know what I did. I screamed, as loud and powerful as I possibly could. I screamed and screamed, like I doubt I had since I was a preschooler. I think I might have freaked it out. Whether it didn't like the frequency, or being afraid made me scream like a girl, or how loud it was, I guess looking back I'll never know. But the more noise I made, it seemed like it was getting really annoyed or pissed. It quickly moved out of the way and into the nearby brush. I stayed there for a few moments longer, catching my breath, and then hoping I was about to die of having a damn heart attack, having survived a freak encounter with a reptoman. Thankfully, I managed to muster up some strength from somewhere, and I too ran out of the river and back to my car, where I didn't even bother changing, just drove home in wet clothes and wet shorts. Don't feel like I scared it off. I think I merely irritated it. It didn't seem too happy about me yelling and screaming and making noise. It seemed irritated, if I had to guess its proper demeanor. Now, why it went off to the bush to my left, I don't know. Part of me likes to think that it was circling around in the brush to come and grab me from behind. But I don't know, because once it exited into the brush, I couldn't hear it anymore. So, that means it could have been possibly waiting to trap me, or even worse, take me away and kill me. We were the first small town in our state to have a nuclear power plant constructed within the town limits. We were told that it was supposed to just be big enough to power us, and they wanted to see what the long-term impact of a nuclear power was on a smaller community. My parents being hardcore environmentalists, and they opposed it from the first whisper of it, which was well before I was ever born. So, it's been around for a long time. I've been paying attention to how my parents felt about the whole thing, and I had also been listening to everybody else's side of the story. This was also the time when just about every phone now had a video camera in it, so it wasn't a stretch of the imagination when I got the notion to go and try and make a documentary about the plant. I didn't share my plans with my parents, because they would have forbidden me to go anywhere near that place, treating it like Chernobyl. I didn't want to be too obvious about what I was doing, so I took the shirt that I was planning on wearing, which was just a denim button-up shirt that had plenty of pockets on the front, and I modified one of the pockets so there would be an opening where the lens of the camera could see out. It wouldn't be a fully unobstructed vision, but it would be better than having the thing out in the open where everybody saw what I was up to. I didn't think anybody in that place was expecting a 17-year-old kid to just walk in and interview people. Everybody was looking at each other, as if this was their first time ever dealing with anybody outside. I politely asked every single person I saw that I would like to speak to whoever ran the place, since I was doing an interview for a personal project. I held a notepad to draw my attention away from the camera, and just like that, the director of the entire facility was paged to come and see me. I remember him being pleasant enough, as far as first impressions go. He had invited me up to his office on the 4th story. He put me at ease and asked me how much he could help me. I told him what I was up to. It was a very pleasant exchange. So, after everything was done, I put the SD card of my phone into my laptop and reviewed the footage. It was remarkable high quality, and the field of view was all but entirely unobstructed. But the longer I watched, the more I saw that I did not remember. The director smiling far less than I remember. Instead, he had this glassy, intense stare. When he sat with me for his interview, his eyes transformed, like having long slit pupils, and his skin looking pale and slightly scaly in appearance, whispering something bizarre under his breath. After those mutterings, I wordlessly got up and marched at a slow pace outside the building on my way back home. There had never been an interview based on what I saw. After going through the footage, there was no actual interview at all. I just sat down with him, and he muttered at me. After studying the footage where he was saying those strange things under his breath, when his eyes transformed, I couldn't help but remark at how much he looked kind of like a snake, or serpentine. He definitely resembled something that was cold-blooded. I don't know if what he did to me was hypnoticism or something else entirely, but I just know that it somehow created false memories in me while wiping out others. What's your take on this? And I'm curious what your listeners would think of this. Not to be presumptuous to think that you would actually broadcast my story, but if you do, I appreciate it. I'm sure there are others like me that have very similar experiences with possibly similar beings and would like to feel validated. Thank you for even taking the time to read this. I was wandering around the woods, a much older growth of oak trees that had seen times long gone by. So, many of the trunks were massive, and many of them were also hollowed out. I was leaning up against one of them, listening to the subtlety of the breeze, when I thought I heard something stirring. It wasn't a scraping sound like you'd expect from the claws of an animal, but somehow softer and more wet. After my curiosity took hold, I started looking for an opening, which wasn't hard to find. This was a large open gash where a cavity had formed over the centuries. There was something that looked akin to the egg sac of a spider, except it was much larger. I usually don't go out of my way to disturb nature, but I couldn't leave this alone. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like it. I took out my pocket knife and began making slight cuts. At first, I thought I discovered the abdomen of an incredibly large baby spider, but the abdomen turned out to be the head of something else. Combine the features of an iguana and a chameleon and a snake and give it human-like eyes, and that's as best as I can describe what was suspended. After a few seconds, this thing's eyes shot up and looked at me. A deafening shriek from behind me made me jump back and stop what I was doing. Something much taller than I, much uglier than me, and yet vaguely resembling the small thing I had just seen in the tree, stood only 3 meters away, leaning forward with its spine parallel to the ground, hissing at me, revealing tons of vicious crocodile-like teeth. I'll always remember that as terrifying. It's a sight that has never left my memory. I immediately stepped away from the tree, and this creature, whatever it was, took the opportunity and lunged forward, doing what I believe bluff charged me. It had the ability to kill me, but chose not to for some reason. I took that as my cue to get the hell out of there, not even looking behind me in case this thing was coming after me. I paid it no more mind. Anyway, I wanted to send my encounter into you, in hopes that someone else has heard something similar, or maybe you have gotten other stories with a similar finding. I feel like mine's a little out there, but nonetheless, just as terrifying. I was gathering water from a river for testing, to see what levels of runoff had been like. To do this, we had to gather from several different points, so many miles away from a selected location. One of those mile markers along the river took me into a patch of woods that grew pretty dense, as far as Michigan woodland goes. I was packing up the tube full of water samples when I looked up and saw something very out of place in the landscape. In the thick growth of the trees, I saw something that looked round, but not perfectly spherical, like an oversized pear, suspended off the ground. I looked around, and there was nobody observing me. The rest of the team was having a coffee break as they waited for me to finish up what I was doing. So, I decided that I could steal 5 minutes to take a closer look at this strange object. I had to climb to a steep bank to get up to where I saw this oddity. Upon closer inspection, it looked like a gigantic gourd that had been hollowed out and mashed in with branches of the trees. It was very much in the family of a paper wasp or a mud dauber's nest, but the scale of it was ridiculous. Something that huge, the size of a military tank, had to have been constructed by something that also was big. My mind was filled with pictures of the so-called murder hornets that have been making news on and off, but I knew hornets weren't big enough to make something like that. Immediately, I was pulled from my thoughts by an eruption of something from the river down below. A figure had emerged that I would have mistaken for a crocodile any other day from a distance, but this thing was even bigger. Stranger yet, it walked on 2 legs, and it had a very, very husky build. It caught sight of me, and its tail began lashing like a cat's. I made a mental connection between its reaction and the object I was investigating. I got out my little pink taser just in case. I had no idea if it would be any good. I began backing away from the nest, or whatever it was, away from the edge of the bank where the main lizard thing would surely appear. It did not disappoint. It looked every bit like an angry parent. I held my taser out, and it suddenly felt very small in my hand. The creature looking much taller when it stood on the same level as I. I kept backing up slowly, my taser extended, trying to get across that I didn't want any trouble, but that I was also capable of defending myself if need be. It looked as though it were going to let me leave as it stood and stared for a very long time. But something inside of it snapped, and it appeared to charge me with its mouth full, open wide. The split second of being rushed was the single most terrifying instance of my life. My taser popped and crackled, and my world went blurry for half a second. The business end of the taser had done its job, and for the briefest of moments, this creature had touched me, and when you tase an attacker that's touching you, you also tase yourself. The disorientation didn't last long, but the fear was still tearing through my body. So, are walking man lizards really a thing? I haven't really listened to your show before now. It's not easy being surrounded by people, but feeling so alone because you have a traumatic story to tell that nobody will believe. I signed up to be an archaeological assistant. It sounds pretty important, but all it means is that you get flown out to a remote location where everybody is so focused on digging something up that they forget about all their comforts and necessities, like a little kid that plays video games until they pee their pants. I didn't get to be directly involved in any of the digging or cataloging of the finds. I got to haul around food and water and rubble and everything unimportant that nobody wanted in the way of more serious work. My story marks my last outing under this kind of employment. Something happened that could have been prevented, and that nobody on site even tried to do anything about. I'm not even sure they were concerned if I was alright. The dig site was at a recently discovered Mayan ziggurat. Don't get too excited, it wasn't very big. It's actually one of the smallest on record, and it might end up in National Geographic for 2 pages. But other than that, there's nothing truly remarkable about it, at least as far as the information they're willing to disclose. There was an extensive system of catacombs under. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that it was bigger underneath than it was on top. It was also very dark, and this team had not come prepared for extensive lighting, which was ridiculous, because the underground work was where most of their efforts began to take place. I'm quietly claustrophobic, and more than a little afraid of the dark. When I signed up under the impression that I'd be mostly working outside, and it's probably what they had in mind at the same time too. But with the discovery of the catacombs underneath, my job description began to receive radical revisions. I kept getting called underground to be removing large chunks of rubble and dirt and other things that nobody else wanted to deal with. Basically a glorified pack mule. Going underground to take care of those little projects was kind of like holding my breath to go underwater to retrieve something. It was just too intense. I had to be continuously pacing myself, and this made my supervisors agitated. It was when I got called underground to a smaller chamber that took a little too long to reach. I started to become undone. The way to do this little chamber was extremely poorly lit, and I stubbed my foot hard more than once. I actually got there at some point or another, and a supervisor told me to take care of all the rocks that were in the way. We weren't allowed to use any lighting that wasn't provided, but I went ahead and used my cell phone and lit up the area. I found that the rocks I was supposed to be hauling out looked nothing like rocks. They resembled eggs, most of them near the size of beach balls, and encrusted with all manners of dirt and slime and other liquid I was afraid to identify. I did voice my concern, and my superiors told me to just shut up and do my job. That's what the moment I should have walked out, but realistically, there was nowhere to go after this. I began hauling the eggs out in the open, above ground. I had to pace myself. The darkness was just too much, and the overall creep factor of these eggs was rather high. It was when I had carried the last of the eggs top of the ground that there was a piercing scream from the entrance. Everybody turned to see one of the archaeologists, scrambling, when something appeared to grab him from behind and drag him back in. Everybody had looked at each other, and even I could almost feel it, what they were thinking. Only one of the people on site was armed, the one designated as a security guard, which, incidentally, was a person who looked like he had never actually used a gun in his life. He did a great deal of waffling, while whatever was underneath came flying outside and mauled 2 or 3 more of us. To give it a best description, it as a crocodile would be grossly inaccurate. It had similarities, but his head was very round, and its mouth was short compared to something like a crocodile. Its body was more round, almost like you described somebody that was heavy set. The eyes were proportionately huge compared to the rest of the head. Think stereotypical aliens. Give that mental image a reptilian cast, and then you have the head structure of this thing, minus the smaller, frailer body. By the time the guard had his gun out and had the nerve to take a shot, he was already being charged and several bodies littered to the ground. I never experienced a bloodbath before in my life, but I wonder if this is anything close to how soldiers feel in combat. I can remember that the first few shots staggered it. One bullet, thankfully, hit it in its head, and surprisingly, it didn't kill it. There was a strange crunching sound. All the eggs, at least the ones around us, were beginning to crack open. I had no idea what to even do at that point. My experience with the entire situation was as fascinating as it was traumatic. Even now, as I'm typing this up for you, all those years later, it's making me shake and shiver, and my keyboarding is suffering for it. As you might have suspected, all the evidence of the monster and what had happened was covered up, probably due to liability more than anything else. I don't think the job had any connection to the government, so it's not like there was a controlled effort to cover up the existence of the species. I don't know if this would be classified as reptilian or what. All the reptilians I've ever heard about are supposedly shape-shifting, scheming demons that are trying to, better yet, manipulate the human race. This felt more like encountering a gorilla than anything else. About 15 or so years ago, my family decided to go down to Florida to visit some relatives that we hadn't seen in a really long time. I was probably 8 years old at the time, and the last time I saw them, I was only a toddler, so I don't remember them at all. I would even get to play with cousins my age, so I was pretty excited. But as it turns out, I fell ill upon the day of our arrival, after 2 days of driving. I was quarantined in one of the guest bedrooms at the back of the house, which luckily had a TV. But it was still pretty lame to be unable to go out and play with my cousins. Other than having meals delivered to me, I didn't interact with anybody at all. It wasn't like I had the energy to get out of bed anyway. On the second night of my sickness, I was watching SpongeBob, trying my best to breathe as my sinuses were absolutely swollen. It had to be super late for an 8-year-old to be up. I'm pretty sure it was about 1 in the morning, but I napped a lot during the day. The entire room was dark, except for the TV. I heard something scraping across the wall outside of me, so I turned down the volume and tried to make out what it could be. I glanced over to the window beside me, but I could only see the reflection of the TV and nothing outside. I decided to ignore it, turning the volume back up and continuing to watch TV. A few minutes passed, and the noises began again, so I once more turned down the volume and checked the window. I screamed at the top of my lungs when I saw the face of a man looking into the window. Except something was very, very wrong. His eyes were massive, probably taking up a fourth of his face, and they were yellow, with cat-like pupils. His face was green and covered in scales, and his mouth had a vague muzzle-like shape. In fact, the entire structure of his face simply got more uncanny the more I stared at him. My aunt came rushing into the room, and I began to cry, telling her about what I saw. She tried to soothe me and told me that perhaps it was just a fever dream. I swore it wasn't, but she eventually managed to distract me by putting on a movie. Soon enough, I drifted off to sleep, waking up in the morning with the TV still going. I felt a little better that day and wanted to go out, but still was not allowed to. So, I found myself watching TV all day again. My sinuses weren't as clogged as that night, so I managed to fall asleep. However, the sounds of the scraping against the house pulled me out of my slumber, and I opened my eyes to the room being completely pitch black. The only hint of light came from the window, and there, I once again spotted this creature staring at me in bed. It flicked out its tongue, which, just like a snake, was forked before putting its hand on the window, seemingly trying to find a way in. Its hands only vaguely resembled that of a person's. They were longer, more narrow, scaly, dark brown, with thick, curved, sharp nails, almost like bird talons. I screamed once more, causing my aunt to rush in. Once again, she arrived. I cried about this thing returning, and that I didn't want to sleep in that room anymore. Since the room was used so sparsely, they had never bothered to install blinds or curtains on the window, meaning that this thing could look at me anytime it wanted, and I wasn't having any of it. So, they just gave in and moved me to the living room. At family reunions, people still poke fun at me for this event. I stand by it though. That thing, whatever I saw, was more real than you can imagine. Back in 2004, I was exploring the deep woods just outside of Paris in France. If you've ever got a chance to visit Paris, I highly recommend it. It is beautiful, even if you are not from there and might be an American or Canadian. There's something for you to see. It's just so captivating. It's also the city of love, in case you didn't know. Anyway, I went out exploring into the deep woods around the city, because again, there's more to explore than just the city itself. We found many great places to look into, from trails to all sorts of deep woods and locations. There's actually a huge amount of amazing trails all outside of Paris that you can hike. Of course, my French is terrible, and if it wasn't for the friend that I was with, who happens to be from France, but her English is really good, I probably wouldn't even made my way to the bathroom in our hotel. So, a huge thanks goes out to her for getting us around here. But anyway, there was a huge amount of trails to explore, so we just started picking a few and going on them. I don't remember the name of the trail, because again, my French is awful, but what I can tell you is that we got by this small lake pond, and something terrible happened. At first, I thought there was a crocodile emerging from the water. Whatever this thing was, it was scaly and green, and it was very, very long. Her and I both freaked. The face almost reminded me of that of a shark, and had large jagged teeth. The head was almost covered in scales and weird eyes, and even had slits on its head. It even had a bony kind of protruding spine, with a very skeletal frame. It was wide, but not overly wide, and almost seemed webbed and scaly in appearance. This thing was a freak of nature, and it climbed out of the water partially, looked over at us, and kind of had an uh-oh look on its face, like it didn't realize we were there, and slowly crawled itself back under the water, as to conceal itself, like it was trying to get out and be sneaky, but didn't realize we were there. It obviously scared the living crap out of both me and my friend, and we booked it out of there. The whole time I kept talking to my friend, asking, "Did you see that? What was that?" Her and I kind of just chalked it up to some sort of mutant fish or lizard. I don't know. I have no idea what kind of dump or waste gets poured out here in the waters, but that's what I assumed it was, since I'm not a believer in ghosts or anything weird like that. But this was something I've never seen before. At the time, there was nobody else on this trail, and of course, throughout our time there in France, I had bothered asking some people about that trail, and asking if anybody else has seen anything weird, to which of course we got the answer, no, there was not. Which leads me to my ultimate conclusion, that we probably just saw some anomaly of nature, some sort of rare mutated creature or lizard. I don't know. I don't know if I'm even submitting this story to the right podcast. It looks like you mostly tell stories that take place at the edge of civilization. Well, my encounter takes place in the heart of it. I was riding the coattails of a very powerful company, one that was rapidly rising in the ranks of energy dominance in the Western world, as in reaching up into those tiers where espionage and foul play began to become part of the equation. I wasn't exactly in the club, but I got to wear a suit, and with other people who were pretty much gods in neckties. I also got to sit in most of the important meetings, which is where this story really begins. This was a critical year for us, and I was at our HQ in Manhattan, where we had gotten word that we had a prospective partner from overseas that was bringing some very tempting offers. At the time, I thought a partnership would have been pointless, since we were doing just fine on our own, crushing the competition. Taking anybody on as a business partner would be an act of benevolence more than a business strategy. So, the meeting came and went, and everything had to be done through a translator. Long story short, I'll spare you as many boring details as I can. There was a deal struck, and the CEO and owner of their company, who is now the owner of our company, seemed to make eye contact with me often. I tried to rot it off as nerves or paranoia from stress, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more I could see him looking at me, almost into me. He would be speaking to somebody else at the conference table. Somebody else would be speaking, but his eyes were on me. Before long, I was invited to what was more or less a personal meeting with the new CEO, if you didn't count the interpreter and one or two silent bouncers. Essentially, gorillas in suits. The new CEO, who we'll call Mr. Moon, greeted me enthusiastically in our first meeting and lavished me with over the acquisition of the company. He remarked that I must be special if my superiors had always kept me nearby, since I didn't occupy the same stature that they did. I thanked him as graciously as possible, and I must not have been very convincing, because his eyes still had that hard aspect to them, that when he was giving me looks from across the conference table. The first meeting ended good though. There were more one-on-ones, and the questions got more probing, and I became more defensive. And then I started to think I saw changes in the man on the other side of the language barrier. When he blinked for a split second, I would see what resembled a second membrane sweep back and forth across his eyes. Then, his eyes had a slight glow to them that was perceptible even in a meeting room where daylight was streaming through the large glass windows. And then his tongue looked different. Several times when he was telling me how happy I would be, the more I embraced the destiny of our two companies, his tongue flicked out differently, not like U's and I's. It was long and more narrow. Once and only once, I thought I saw it move in a way that didn't seem possible. When you see something like that only once, you think you're losing your mind. I felt cornered in these meetings, and I studied the way the new CEO and his people regarded me. It was like they weren't sure what to do with me, as if they weren't sure that they could get through to everybody but me. Whatever tactics or whatever they were using that worked on everybody else, it wasn't fazing me. Look, I'll be blunt. I'm convinced that this man and his people are reptilians, and they have used hocus pocus or some kind of mind control technique to secure the acquisition of our company and the cooperation of everybody in their way. I've listened to your past stories about similar creatures being found in remote and wild areas, which just adds another chilling dimension to my experience and makes it all the more real for me. It means these things are everywhere, whether they're embodying human beings or whether they're just in their fleshly beast bodies, whatever that means. That means they're watching us wherever we are, from the bottom of human society all the way to the top. So, my story isn't necessarily a monster sighting, as it is just a creature that I've never seen before, nor heard of, nor could properly identify. But first, before I get into that, I'm going to give you just a tidbit of backstory. Don't worry, I'm not going to feed you a novella of backstory. Years ago, maybe about 4 or 5, I think it was about 2015 or 2014, if my memory serves me right. I was visiting some friends all over Australia, since I just found the time to vacation down there finally, and it's a trip I'd been planning for a long time. These friends of mine took me all over the country, visiting all sorts of amazing sights. We spent a lot of time traveling, and in between that time, we spent a lot of time seeing the wild, even going as far into Central Australia as we could. Now, for those that don't know, assuming and hoping you'll read this to your audience, Australia is home to a vast wildlife and environment. Everything from desert to wetlands, and everything in between, which means there is a vast array of all different sorts of life that is only found exclusively in the land down under. Another reason why I love the country. Anyway, at some point or another during our travels, I thought I saw what I thought was initially a crocodile. But this thing didn't quite look like a crocodile, at least the closer we got to it. It was much larger and looked much more grotesque looking, had bizarre features. In fact, it looked more like an alien crossed with a frog, crossed with a crocodile. It was a very strange looking creature. I'd even nudged a few of my friends and told them to check it out, and they too were very perplexed at the sight. Now, to kind of give you more information, this thing was kind of just sitting there along the side of a large river, and it didn't really make a lot of sense. I knew Australia were already home to weird things, especially like reptiles, snakes, crocodiles, you name it, but I had never quite seen a creature like this before. It resembled that of a crocodile, at least in size, probably spanning 12 to 15 feet. I mean, this thing looked like a living dinosaur. But its face wasn't that of a crocodile. It had teeth, and kind of resembled one, but its face and snout were much shorter, and its body, like I said, almost resembled that much more of a frog than it did an alligator or a crocodile. It didn't really have scales as much as it looked to have amphibious skin. Again, it's really hard to describe because of how we saw it, but it was very strange, and at the time, none of my close friends knew, or even now, know exactly what it was we saw. They've never seen it, they have never heard anything like it, nor did any of us ever see anything like it again afterwards. We kind of just left it be, and didn't really bring it up again. But sometimes, when we talk, we'll still bring it up, because it was so weird. But I guess when you're in the outback, I mean not just the desert outback, but out in the middle of nowhere, thick in the Australian bush, you'll probably run into all sorts of stuff that you didn't know exist. I mean, hell, I can't even imagine the things Australian indigenous people run into that most of us, civilized society, have no idea still exists. There is so much room and area for things to roam without ever being discovered. especially in a place like Australia, where there's so much room for things and creatures to go undiscovered by man. About 2 years ago, a close friend and I decided to visit the Aztec Falls, which is just outside of LA. I don't know if it's that we went on an off day or what, but there was hardly anybody else around, which usually always makes for a much greater time swimming. Anyway, it went as usual, so there's really no need to fill you in with boring details about us swimming and doing stuff. But as we were leaving, we saw a creature that we can't even identify. This was a creature that came right out of our nightmares, something we would have never expected to ever see in our lives. This unusual creature appeared to almost float on the water, coming towards us. It had the face of a dragon almost, with a red covering its entire body, like its body was a deep red, which is one of the reasons it stood out so much. It was terrifying looking. It had little horns sticking out of its body, and small, jagged brown little spikes or thorns, if that makes sense. It almost kind of had a deformed, swollen face. My friend and I were partially frozen in fear and curiosity, just to try to make out exactly what it is we were looking at. But the closer this thing got, the more we were actually able to make out that this wasn't anything natural. The closer it got, it began to open its mouth and reveal large, tiny little teeth, full of sharp fangs. We got out of there pretty quickly, and luckily, I don't think anybody else was victim or even saw what we did, since we seemed to be in an area where nobody else was around. Back in the summer of 1995, myself and my sister both suffered a very traumatic miscarriage. It was a terrible time, and we both grieved in very different ways. The one way we both coped, though, was to every day, for the entire summer, go down to the beach and watch the sunrise every morning. We both would sit there, watching the sun come up in the sky, and grieve in our own way. We are now both in our late 50s, and feel it might be the right time to come forward about an experience we had during the summer. As we watched the sun come in one morning, my sister persuaded me to go down to the waves and soak my feet in the tide. I did so, thinking it might be nice to feel the sea on my feet at this time in the morning. We stood at the shore for around 2 or 3 minutes. My sister pointed out that she could see something black swing past. We didn't know what it could be, but just dismissed it as a trick of the light. Then, a few moments later, she noticed the same thing swim past. I saw it too, and didn't know what it was. It looked like a submarine, but that was a ridiculous notion, as it was only about 5 or 10 feet deep in the water. Then, the next thing, we both fell back onto our backsides and screamed in terror. A reptilian-looking creature, the face of a crocodile, and the body that resembled a human, was swimming past us, with its body diving in and out of the water. It had green scaly skin, very large muscles, and crooked-like feet, which ended in long, webbed paws that had sharp toenails like fangs. It's very weird to describe, but that's what it looked like. The creature had a very horrendous face, and 2 huge black holes for eyes, and a large mouth. The creature, whatever this was, thrashed around in the water, as if it was hunting for prey, and glanced once at us, but somehow showed little interest. It continued flopping around the water for about a few minutes. We both just lay there with our mouths open in horror and shock, as the sun illuminated us both in the scene of the horror. When the creature had submerged and left, we both came to our senses and managed to walk back to our cars without losing it. We had talked about the incident since and wondered whether we should tell anybody. I told my husband, but he assured me at the time that it was just a side effect of my meds. I had been on Prozac after the miscarriage. I know what I saw was real to this day. Nobody believes me, except my sister, since we had both suffered intermittent depression for the last 25 years, and my sister suffers really bad from panic attacks. I think this was the incident that triggered her panic. I can't describe to you the horror of what I saw. It was hideous looking. I've never seen a creature like it, ever. Now, anytime I go to the ocean, that's always at the forefront of my mind. A few months after that experience, there was a shark attack on the beach, and a kid had died. Perhaps I witnessed something supernatural, or perhaps this was some kind of unknown creature that marine biologists have yet to discover. I think it would help me and my sister if we knew what we saw was real or not. I know it is. My career as a security guard began and ended at Fort Knox. I know, you think that they'd be a little more picky about who they recruit. The place is impregnable by any human means, so the guards just need warm bodies with opposable thumbs that can make phone calls and watch security feeds. Note that I said Fort Knox is impregnable by any human means. I had little experience that shows me that humans are the only creatures interested in material assets. Coming up on the place is pretty much a suicide attempt, but that doesn't keep the occasional figure showing up on camera at the very edge of the property. You gotta think, people are just curious, minus all the security measures, more wealth than they've ever seen sitting just a short distance away. But since the place is surrounded by steel fences, machine guns, landmines, and guard boxes, nobody really ever gets close. Well, one night, I spotted movement on the usual feed. A large shape was moving around the edge of the fence, as if it were more than just a curious visitor. That guy looks like they might actually be dumb enough to try and break in. I was right. This figure scaled the fence in no time, a feat considering that it is both electrified and has barbed wire at the top. Before I could react, the figure also slinked across the expanse of booby-trapped turf, triggering nothing. Its steps were carefully placed, and its overall movement was fluid and graceful. It almost looked like it was swimming through the air. I radioed that somebody had breached the perimeter and was rapidly advancing towards the central bunker. You know what? Since nobody believed that this place could be broken into, everyone was asleep at their posts for the night. I was the only one remaining vigilant, and I couldn't do anything except bark over the walkie-talkie. So, I decided to focus on getting a clear image of the intruder, who had bypassed the laser-triggered alarm and began scaling the granite walls. It was when the figure was climbing closer to the sheer granite walls that I realized I was dealing with nothing mundane. Not only was this moving with incredible speed, but a long tail dangled behind it. It looked and moved the way I've seen some species of lizards do, just the way they scale trees, with the very same fluid, liquid movements. For half a second, the thing paused its ascent and looked over its shoulder into the camera. The face was indistinct, but two eyes glowed with mischief, reflecting the night vision back into the lens. I was on the walkie every 30 seconds, and by the time I was finally able to rouse somebody, it seemed too late. The creature, the person, whatever this was, had gotten past the most sophisticated equipment in the country, and upon further investigation, had made it all the way into the vault. This was something obviously akin to lizards. It must have been sentient and intelligent. I tried to resist the connections that were being made in my mind, but logic is logic. If a thief breaks in for the sake of breaking in, it's either a thrill seeker or a test, an audit. A reptilian monster was performing an audit of Fort Knox's security measures. Why would the United States government put such a creature up to a security audit unless the people assigning the audit were reptilians themselves? When you work this closely with the government, you hear all the conspiracy theories that are there to be heard. But that night, I began to buy to them, and I suddenly feel very uncomfortable about who I'm working for. I was taking my family camping. We're a small clan. Just me, my wife, and my 6-year-old son. We're pretty much city slickers, so we don't quite go hardcore on roughing it. We had a tent and a means of building a fire, but we also kept a camper nearby, just in case the experience got to be too much for any of us to handle. I know, don't laugh at me. I'm surprised and proud to say that we held out better than most. My son complained about the bugs for about an hour, but then he was charmed by the entire thing. So, I was obligated to suppress my own complaints about insects and heat and the like. It was the second night, and we were all in our tents. My son had his own tent that was small. It was like a little bubble that was attached to ours. I was awoken by the sound of my son calling my name gently. He sounded a little hoarse, and my parental instincts immediately made me wonder if something was wrong. This sense heightened when I realized that his voice was coming from outside the tent. So, I relaxed a little bit, thinking he needed me to guide him to the outdoor toilet or something. But there was still something about his voice that was off-putting. I unzipped the tent to see what was the matter. His voice came again, but it was far away. I whispered, "Son?" Then I heard something like his voice, asking me to come here. There wasn't any reason not to, but it didn't feel right. I replied that he should come here, but this got me no answer. Then a thought occurred to me. It was crazy, but this was his whole experience. I carefully unzipped a flap between my tent and my son's bubble tent, while firing at my cell phone screen for a light. There was my son, asleep. I heard the same voice again outside the tent. This time, I did not answer. After a while, the fire pit was kindled again. And apparently, whoever was out there had some coals that were still red, and added some wood on or something. That's when I heard an animalistic hissing noise come from the silhouette that I could barely see from the light of the fire. It looked like something bestial, long limbs, and a neck that sloped seamlessly into a skull and shoulders, and I could see it had some sort of tail with pointed features, picked out by the glow of the faint fire. This thing hesitated for a moment, and then ran away into the trees. It had the shape and movement of almost a dragon, if that makes sense, like an upright walking Komodo dragon, I should clarify. It was terrifying looking, even though I never got to actually peek out my tent and see this thing for what it was. But again, I'm glad I didn't, because I didn't want to. But I saw enough of the silhouette that it looked just like a Komodo dragon that was walking on 2 legs, that ran away quickly. Needless to say, we cut our camping trip short after that, and I'm sending you my story since I don't think anybody else will believe me, and I know there's only few that will share my story. I was pregnant with my first child and hosted a massive baby shower in the backyard of my house. I live in the South, and at the time it was spring, so the weather was fantastic, and hosting the event outside made it easier as my house wouldn't get trashed. Still, I was absolutely exhausted by the end of the night, and as my husband was gone for a work trip, I didn't have anybody to help me clean up. So, I said screw it. I was too tired and too pregnant to bother. I decided to let the wild animals eat whatever food was left and then clean up the rest in the morning. I know, bad call. I took a shower, brushed my teeth, and then went off to bed. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of a balloon popping in my backyard. My heart began to race, and I peeked out the blinds, scanning the area to see what I could find. After a few moments, I saw something quickly weaving its way through the chairs and tables, knocking over a few in the process. I blinked a couple of times, but I couldn't seem to make out what was out there. It then occurred to me that I'd left the food out, and that must have been what the animal was looking for. I was ready to ignore it and go back to bed when the sound of a squawk caught my attention once more. I again tried to see what it was, but it was just too dark. I made my way down the stairs, flicked on the back light, and went out the back door, peering into the distance. I gasped as my eyes met that of something that looked straight out of a horror or sci-fi film. It was a person, but with incredibly strange posture. Its skin tight upon its body, yet appeared to be covered in scales. Its eyes reflected from the light, and it had a tail that rested near its feet, in which they more closely resembled a bird's talons. It let out the same squawk sound that I heard a few minutes prior, and I shut and locked the door. It ran up to it, scratching the wood deeply as it tried to get in, banging on the door, nearly breaking the entire door down with its immense weight. I was screaming hysterically, running back up the stairs as fast as I could. I shut and locked the door behind me, and even put a chair under the knob for good measure, not knowing what else to do. I knew if this thing broke the door down there, well, a measly chair holding the door back wouldn't do anything. I would be done. I called my husband in absolute hysterics, not taking into consideration that he was probably sleeping. Even though he was out of it, he perked up as soon as he heard how panicked I was, and he believed me. He wanted me to check if it was still there. I looked out the window and could still see it moving around, so I confirmed to him that it was. He told me to stay inside, and I told him I didn't plan on going out. He asked me if I was okay. Had it hurt me? And I told him no. He asked me if I should call the police, and I was torn. Word spreads fast in our little town, and I was worried if the monster, whatever this thing was gone by the time the cops arrived. I'd hurt our reputation, since we're kind of known in our community. My husband stayed on the phone with me, and I continued to watch this reptile freak of nature move around, before it finally let out to seem would be a frustrated noise and leapt away into the thick forest. I waited a few moments, but it didn't seem to come back out. My husband and I talked a bit longer, and I finally had to let him go after what felt like hours of phone conversation, keeping him on the line for my own comfort. After that, I just laid in bed and waited, thankful that neither I nor my baby were hurt. I was too scared to go downstairs anytime soon. For unrelated reasons, we moved a few years later. My son was eventually born and was old enough. I actually told him the story, and even though I expressed to him how terrified I was and how we encountered something that doesn't exist, he just seemed bummed out that he wasn't actually able to see it for himself. Go figure. I've seen some wild things out of my days of hiking out in the backcountry, and I have two really bizarre sightings to share with you. The first one takes place in central Idaho, out in the backcountry. Now, before I go on to the actual encounter, both of these sightings, I appeared to see nearly the same creature. At least, they were nearly identical, which leads me to the speculation that these are from the same species, which means there's not just one of them. I have also had several run-ins with Bigfoot, so I know there are things that go bump in the night, and things we can't explain. To how many of these creatures exist, well, that I have no idea. I was setting up camp, and right across where I was camping at was a rather large creek, which was very convenient for me, since I had access to water just right there. But as the evening grew, and I felt like it was near time to turn in, when I heard something really large approaching me from the forest behind me. I turned, and out from the woods stepped this thing. I can only describe it as a thing, because I don't know what to even call it. If I were to use actual words to describe it, I would say it was a human-like lizard with a dinosaur as a head. I know that sounds incredibly crazy, but that's exactly what it looked like. It looked like an upright walking lizard, and the head almost resembled that of something you would see in the movie Jurassic Park. It had fierce yellow eyes, and although it never opened its mouth or showed any teeth, it just looked at me and kind of studied me for a minute, and then turned around and casually walked back the way it came, as if just running into me and not thinking much more of it. I was shocked, and even though it was nighttime, or getting near night, I tore down my tent and decided to just hike as much as I could into the night with as little light as possible. I didn't want to camp near whatever that was. I had no idea if it was capable, or maybe it was going to come back to case my tent, or me. My second encounter happens out in the backwoods of Mississippi, where I had a nearly identical situation. Now, the first creature had a dark green and light green patterns on its body, with little specks of brown on its face. Again, had you looked at this thing, it looked right out of a video game, or even a movie, even though in appearance, this one looked very similar to the first one that I saw. This one looked much more evil, and unlike the first one, didn't have as much slender features as it did masculine and muscular. This thing was also darker in color, more almost like a black-green, so to speak, and its eyes seemed to give off a much different fierceness to it. I stumbled upon it when I came upon this thing eating a dead doe. In response to my appearance and arrival, it acted hostile immediately, and what I believe bluff-charged me. Now, I didn't impede on this thing's meal. I was visible from probably about 50 feet away, but it instantly sensed my presence, and I don't know if these things have a territory or markings or what, but it acted out of pure hostility, and this thing was fast. I ran in fear, and even though I come equipped, I didn't plan on shooting something that I don't know what it is, especially considering 1, there could be more of them, and 2, what if I didn't kill it and only pissed it off more? It's not worth my life. I had enough time to flee, and although it didn't seem to pursue chasing me, it was enough to scare me. Looking back on the situation, I think being scared more came from that I'd never seen a creature like this, and then it acted aggressive, not knowing if it was capable of killing me. And even now, when I ponder back to it, I always think about what if. It could have killed me had I stayed around, especially considering I don't know exactly what it is that I was dealing with. What I saw is something you would expect to see around the swamps, or something out of a movie, but not in the middle of the woods. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but sometimes I wonder, do genetic experimentations make it out into the woods by themselves? Since the first time I encountered this in Idaho, back a few years ago, it was just casually wandering around, and it happened to run into me. This time though, when I saw the different one in the backwoods of Mississippi, it was casually eating a deer, doing its own thing, when I stumbled upon the pasture that it was in, and it immediately saw me as a threat. I wonder if there's a reason for that, but more importantly, I want to ask the real questions. What are these things? What is their purpose? And what is their intent? During the late 90s, my parents were going through some pretty tough financial issues to the point where they couldn't even afford to put food in my mouth. I had to be sat down and given a tough talk, where I was informed I'd have to move states away from all my friends, attend a new school, and live with my dad's brother and his wife for an indefinite amount of time. I was 11 when this happened, and it ended up lasting throughout all of my adolescence. I was unsurprisingly not happy, and for a long time did not warm up to what were essentially my new parents. A few weeks after my move, in an effort to try and bond with me, my uncle said he wanted me to help him do some yard work, and that after it was all done, we could go get some ice cream. I begrudgingly agreed. He told me to get some things out of his shed, and to grab the key in the laundry room, which had a keyring of a grizzly bear. Once I found it, I went out to the shed, unlocked it, opened it up, and went to search for what my uncle wanted me to get. However, I froze in my tracks as my eyes took in the sight before me. Something was curled up in a fetal-like position on the floor, heavily breathing. It looked nearly alien. It was monkey-like in shape, but about the size of a human child, not much smaller than me at the time. It had reptile skin, and its bones stuck out through every part of its body. It was like a bearded dragon almost, except in human form. It clearly had been starving for some time. It had long gangly fingers and claws at the end, and its tail curled around its limbs. Its eyes were closed, but it flicked them open to look at me, and they were yellow, very serpent-like. It opened its mouth slowly and hissed, revealing jagged, sharp teeth. I quickly moved out of fear, grabbed the things, and shut the door behind me, breathing and hyperventilating. I still wasn't entirely trusting towards my uncle, so I decided to just keep my mouth shut and let this be his problem when he came across it. I did the yard work with him, and we went out to go get ice cream, and the reptile thing ended up slipping my mind. It was sunset by the time we returned home, and my uncle asked me to go put everything back where it was in the shed. It was then that I immediately remembered the reptile. I was curious to see if it was still there, so I grabbed the things and opened the door. It was still there, still laying in the same spot on the floor. It looked up at me again, and I put the objects away. But my curiosity got the best of me, so I grabbed a nearby fishing pole and poked at it. After a few moments, it stood up on two legs and hissed and acted extremely aggressive, to where I screamed and ran away, outside. This thing took off after me, and then bolted off left into the trees. I didn't bother chasing after it, for obvious reasons. My uncle heard my screams and came out running, asking what was wrong. Not knowing what to say, I just told him I felt a big spider crawl on me. He laughed and then went back inside. After 4 or so months passed, I finally felt like I'd formed a close enough bond with my aunt and uncle to be able to finally tell them what it is that I saw. They listened and told me they'd keep an eye out for it, even though they'd never seen it before. Anyway, I'm writing this up now because just this morning, my uncle called me up to tell me that after 20 years, he finally saw it. After my brother and I graduated high school, because we had a really crappy upbringing, we ended up roommating together and got this little house. What was wonderful about that house was that it had a detached garage. But it wasn't a detached garage in the typical sense, where you'd have your house, some space, and then the garage. No, it was almost like a detached garage that was built much later on, far back behind the house. I don't think any cars were ever stored in there, nor was there really any pathway or driveway created to go up to that detached garage. When we got into it, it was mainly just a giant room used for storage. So think like a large open room like a garage, but just detached, and probably about 200 feet directly behind our house, bordering some thick woods to the left, and some fields to the right, followed by more thick woods. Directly behind that is wetlands, and lots of it. Directly to the front of the house was our large yard, and then a singular road that if you go for about 15 to 18 minutes, will take you right into town. I say 15 to 18 minutes because it just depends on how fast you drive. My brother and I were rarely ever home at the same time, considering he worked the night shift and I worked during the day. And a lot of the time our schedules would overlap if we weren't working normal shifts. So, meaning that usually one of us was always home, but hardly if ever both at the same time. Well, one time during the day, I got a phone call from my brother, and he was freaking out, screaming at me, telling the damn lizard man was trying to break into the back garage. I kinda laughed at him and told him he was having a nervous breakdown, but he told me exactly what I just told you. I thought he was trying to pull a prank, so I just humored him and tell him I would check it out when I got home. Well, when I got home that evening, he had to already have left because he had to go to his work. So, I checked out the back garage. Like I said, it was about roughly 200 feet away from the house. Just estimating, of course. I didn't actually measure. I did see large indents in the wet ground, but nothing that I would chalk up to something a lizard man supposedly made. I showed no signs of a break-in at all. Checking the door handle, the door, any markings on the siding, nothing. So, whatever I thought. I went back inside, watched TV, and did my thing. I want to say it was about 7:45, maybe 7:50 in the evening, right when I started to hear loud banging and ruckus. I got up, thinking some sort of animal was wandering outside. The noise was coming from back by the garage, and it was loud. It sounded like somebody was trying to break the door down. So I grabbed my flashlight that I keep by the door, run outside, and shine it in the direction. I dropped my flashlight and my mouth at the same time in absolute horror. As soon as I shone my light on the door of the garage, this thing, a flipping lizard man, turned its head to look right at me. This thing was hideous, from head to toe. I mean, a description isn't really needed. If you just jump on the internet and look up lizard man, this is about as general as you can get. This lizard man was pitch black though. It wasn't green like you'd expect it to be, or if there's any color that you would expect a lizard man to be. At least I think of reptiles, so I think of green. But it was pitch black and had huge, large yellow eyes. It saw me, but I think it just saw the light that I shone at it, because it instantly dropped down on all fours and sprinted off back into behind the garage where the wetlands are. I heard it trotting off, and it sounded incredibly heavy. I ran back inside immediately, called my brother's cell phone, which surprisingly he picked up. He usually doesn't when he's at work. I flipped out on him, told him I saw what he was talking about, and then I apologized for ever doubting him. We came to the conclusion that we need to do something, but what? Just like in the movies, calling the police isn't going to do anything. They're not going to believe you, they think you're going to be pulling a prank, and of course, anything they find or don't find will always result in inconclusive, and they'll give you the same old answer. We'll look into it. Yeah, right. So, we decided to take matters into our own hands by setting up traps all around our garage. We had a couple bear traps lying around, but also smaller traps. We set those up, and then I waited. The next couple nights, nothing happened. And then finally, one morning I got up, which probably would have been about 3 or 4 nights since I saw what I did, and every trap that we had placed, which was probably about 5, were completely gone. Nowhere to be found, no signs of them being picked up or taken or dragged away. Just gone. That freaked us out. So, my brother and I decided to stay at a friend's house for a couple weeks, just until we can get our heads level and figure out what it is we were wanting to do. Our good friend of ours let us borrow some of his guns. He had a shotgun and a magnum and a couple of other high-powered, high-caliber weapons. I'm not talking anything like a 50 caliber rifle or anything, but a little bit more punch than just a typical 9mm Beretta. So, we ended up going back to the house and having our weapons ready, just in case this thing tried to break into our house and get to us. Well, nothing really happened for the next few weeks afterwards, and that few weeks turned into a couple of months. After a while, it had been nearly 3 months since we saw or heard any activity, and then we got a call from our landlord. He was giving us 30 days to move out. Apparently, he was going to put the house on the market and sell it, because he was in a financial bind. His wife had passed recently, and he desperately needed the money. I guess he was going to ditch the state and head somewhere way south. So, long story short, my brother and I had to find a different place to go. My brother actually found an apartment complex, probably maybe 10 miles away from there, where I moved out of town completely. Anyway, fast forward to today. That was nearly 20 years ago, back in 2002, and we still talk about it from time to time. We always wonder, what was it? What could it have been? It's easy to sit there and say you don't believe monsters exist until you truly are put in a situation where you have to deal with one. I grew up in a very religious, conservative, and traditional household in rural Georgia. I practically lived and breathed my church, and only ever attended private schools, all the way up until I graduated. Part of the curriculum, in order to graduate from my high school, was going on a missionary trip. After a hurricane down in Florida, my school gave us the opportunity to volunteer to help feed those who were now homeless from their houses being destroyed. Most of my class, myself included, decided to go and help out. We took a bus down to an old mansion that my school had rented out. It was just far enough away from the storm to be able to not have to been touched by it. So despite its age, it was in pretty solid condition. Working electricity, plumbing, it even had air conditioning, and so forth. I was told that it was usually rented out as a venue for things like weddings, but the landowner had appreciated the school's thoughtfulness so much that he gave them a huge discount. The staff also figured keeping every kid in one area would ultimately be cheaper and easier to pull off, instead of stuffing us in multiple rooms across a hotel. All in all, I was pretty excited to check the place out. When we arrived, we were greeted by a huge lawn in which a backyard bordered a swamp. The yard had a shed, a swing set, and a garden, which included benches to sit under the trees that were there within it. The inside of the mansion was very open and bright, the reminiscent of Greek architecture. It had lots of fireplaces and somewhat unnerving statues. The bedrooms housed up to 6 people each and had strange paintings on the walls. The place even had an indoor pool, although we weren't allowed to swim in it, mostly because the adults didn't want to deal with boys and girls being scantily clad within close quarters atop of having to make sure nobody drowned. We had pretty basic rules, and a schedule relayed to us. No sneaking off, no swimming in the swamp or pool, no boys and girls' bedrooms, and vice versa, no stealing food from the kitchen, no sleeping in, and so forth. Our schedule consisted of waking up at 7:30, breakfast at 8, volunteering from 9 to 3 with a 45-minute break in between, dinner at 4, lessons from 5 to 7, being allowed to use our cell phone from 7 to 8:30, and lights out by 9. We'd start volunteering the following morning, and dinner was being prepared for us kids, so we had time to kill. While we weren't allowed to swim in the swamp, the adults didn't have a problem with us fishing in it. So, my friend and I, let's call him Sam, had brought some gear along with us to see what we could catch. A girl we knew, we'll call her Jasmine, decided to join us and talk to us while we did our thing. She mostly talked to Sam, as I have a tendency to zone out when I'm doing mundane tasks. We ended up catching a couple things, but released them back into the water, just as we were about to finish up. Jasmine pointed out a strange shape that just poked up out of the water. My vision has always been kind of bad, and I forgot to bring my glasses on the trip. So at first I thought it was a rock, but then I realized it was a crocodile. We watched it for a minute or so, before collectively agreeing to not tell any of the staff, as to not risk any more restrictions. We soon had dinner, and afterwards, Sam pulled me aside and said he wanted to wrestle the crocodile into submission in order to impress Jasmine. We were still very early in high school and only 14, so for a boy his age to have such ideas, while stupid, wasn't unheard of. Even though I was the same age, by that point I knew better, and I called him an idiot. He called me a wimp. I told him Jasmine would think he was stupid, but he insisted that she wouldn't, and so on. We went back and forth for a bit, but neither of us budged on our positions, and our conversation died by the time it was time for lessons. He didn't bring it up the following day while at breakfast or volunteering, so I figured he must have either changed his mind or simply forgot. It wasn't until the bus brought us back to the mansion that I lose track of Sam. I found him by the swamp with Jasmine, and he was letting her fish with his gear. I went over to join them, and for a few minutes, nothing happened, until Jasmine mentioned spotting the crocodile again. It was swimming to the left of us. That is when Sam brought up his bold idea of wrestling the crocodile once more. Jasmine just laughed, not taking him very seriously at first, but then he began to follow the crocodile down its path. I once again tried to convince Sam that he was an idiot, and both Jasmine and I chased after him. We were beginning to stray pretty far from the property, to the point that we had to make our way through some wild, unkempt forestry. I knew that if we were gone too long, we could get into serious trouble. Sam stopped to pick something off the ground, and by the time we caught up to him, he'd thrown it into the water. It missed the crocodile, but seemed to get its attention. Both Jasmine and I were begging him to knock it off. He picked up his stick and told us to take it easy, and threw it. I tried to stop him, but couldn't block it in time. This time, it did hit the crocodile. Its head poked from the water, and it hissed at us. I screamed to Sam that he pissed it off and we needed to leave. But before any of us knew it, it descended from the water in a completely upright manner. The swamp couldn't have been more than a few feet deep, and we could see the upper half of this thing's body. It had a toned humanoid shape, despite being covered in dark green scales. It began to trudge through the marsh, hissing all the while. I caught glimpses of its lower arms, which seemed nearly long enough to go down to its knees, as they would on a person. Like I said, I don't have great vision, but its hands looked to be very similar to the shape of a person's, except they had long, black nails on the ends of them, nearly qualifying as claws. We screamed and ran off, trying to make our way through the shrubbery in order to get back onto the property. We yelled, warning everybody outside about the nearby monster, and most people just looked at us in confusion. Past the forestry, it let out another hiss. Some heard it, and others did not, causing only more confusion. One of the adults nearby ushered us inside, and after a couple of minutes of gathering everybody, they began counting heads. Once it was confirmed we were all inside, Sam, Jasmine, and I began to get questioned about what we saw. We repeated what we had already said. Most people had their own opinions and comments on the matter, but they were shushed. The adults didn't know what to think. They weren't sure if we were just pulling the prank. We stressed that we weren't. One of them pointed out that regardless of our specific story, a part of it wasn't true. She did hear the hiss of a crocodile in the nearby marsh, meaning that there was definitely one out there. One of the more superstitious, older staff members did believe us, and presumed that the crocodile was an evil spirit. They debated calling the police, and at this point, many students were demanding to have their phones so they could call their parents. I knew it was going to be a long night, so I just laid in my bed upstairs. We ended up being kept inside the rest of the day, and it had an hour-long prayer session solely dedicated to banishing the spirit, cutting into half of our lesson time. I couldn't tell which I'd rather do, if I'm being honest. I was still making sense of the creature myself, and trying to come to a conclusion of what exactly I saw. The next morning, I woke up to some ruckus going on downstairs. Apparently, while checking out the area at dawn to make sure it was safe, one of the staff members saw the crocodile in the distance. She said it stood at about 7 to 8 feet tall. Its body looked like a malformed person's, with its bones jutting out at strange angles. As the day went on, we skipped going to volunteer, as the adults figured out what to do. They ended up letting us have our cell phones back, and called the landowner in a nearby hotel to try and move us instead. Around evening, we were all ushered into the bus and driven off to a hotel, about 30 miles away. Once we got there, some parents had driven down to pick up their kids, Jasmine's parents included, but otherwise the mission trip was going to resume as usual once we all got settled in. I gave Sam some crap about how he had ruined both the mission trip and his own chance to get with Jasmine, but I figured that the incident alone was enough of a lesson for him not to mess with wild animals. The rest of the trip resumed as normal, although the crocodile was basically the main talk amongst us kids the entire time. Because one of the staff members saw the monster for herself, most of the adults had believed it was some sort of demonic entity by that point, so we were often shushed and even punished if we were caught discussing the thing. Some kids had their phones taken away for the rest of the trip as well, and some would have detention upon returning to school. The staff were worried we'd attract its attention and potentially even risk it following us back to Georgia. Of course, being forbidden from chatting about it made us want to talk about it even more. Now, it's been a long time since this event, and I've had a lot of time to sit on my thoughts regarding the whole matter. These days, I don't consider myself as deeply religious or conservative as the way I was raised, but I still am a Christian and am active in my local church and community. I have told my story to many people within its sense, and while some believe it was some sort of demon, most seem to figure it was simply a bizarre living creature that's from this earth. That's the conclusion I've come to as well. I've been down to Florida many times since then, a few times not even being too far off from the location of said mansion. I have never seen anything like it since. I mean, not that I particularly wish to,